It was a cold, neon-drenched night when, after an ordinary evening at home, I decided to drive into the city to clear my head. Passing a dimly lit bar on a quiet side street, my eyes caught a scene so jarringly real it froze my blood. Through the rain-splattered window, I saw my wife, laughing and leaning into another man. In that moment, every promise and every tender word we once shared disintegrated into bitter ash. I knew then that I had to expose the truth. For years, I had believed our life was a tapestry woven from trust, shared dreams, and quiet routines. My wife and I had built a comfortable existence together, a modest home filled with mutual respect, daily rituals of conversation over dinner, and weekends spent in simple joy. I trusted her implicitly. Her smile was the beacon that guided my days, and her gentle reassurances were the foundation upon which I built my future. But as the days passed, subtle hints of distance began to gnaw at my heart. I noticed her occasional distracted glances at her phone during our conversations, the hurried excuses for late nights out, and the peculiar way her eyes would sometimes look past me as if searching for something, or someone else. That fateful night, the mundane act of driving home took an unexpected turn. I'd left home early after a long day at work, planning to clear my mind with a drive through the city's rain-soaked streets. The sky was a canvas of swirling clouds, and the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement in shimmering ribbons. My thoughts wandered to the comfort of home when a flicker of movement caught my eye, a soft glow emanating from a bar window on a narrow, less-traveled street. I slowed down, curiosity battling with an inexplicable dread, and turned my gaze toward that light. What I saw next shook me to the core. Through the rain-dappled glass, I caught a glimpse of my wife sitting at a high table in the dim interior of the bar. She was laughing, a laugh that, to my horror, wasn't solely hers. A man, unknown to me, sat close by, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. Their interaction was intimate and relaxed, an open display of connection that I had never seen before. Every fiber of my being screamed that my worst fears were coming true. I pulled over onto the curb, heart pounding so violently I could barely breathe. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene, even as my mind raced with a million questions. How long had this been going on? Who was he? And why had I never noticed the signs? I sat there in agonizing silence as the rain continued to pour, blurring the neon signs outside. My heart was a tumult of betrayal and disbelief. I tried to recall every small detail from our recent interactions, the vague, rushed explanations when she mentioned a work event, the furtive glances she cast at her phone when I walked into the room, the subtle changes in her tone when asked about her day. Each memory now felt like a piece of a puzzle I had been too blind to see. The truth, in all its painful clarity, was now laid bare before me, and I was forced to confront the unbearable reality. My wife was cheating on me. The shock was unbearable, yet even as I sat there, a grim resolve began to form deep inside me. I couldn't simply drive away and pretend that nothing had happened. I knew that I had to expose the truth, to force her to confront the consequences of her actions, not just for my sake, but for the sake of our once sacred vows. I started by recording every detail in my journal. I scribbled down the exact time I saw her, the description of the man by her side, and every fleeting moment that confirmed the betrayal. My pen scratched out words in jagged, angry lines. I trusted you with my soul, and now that trust lies in ruins. The act of writing became both a catharsis and a declaration of war against the deception that had infiltrated our lives. As the minutes turned to hours, I realized that the path ahead was fraught with painful decisions. I could either let this moment of betrayal paralyze me, or I could take it as a catalyst, a call to reclaim my dignity and reshape my future. The image of her, so at ease in that dim bar with a stranger, haunted my every thought. I felt the crushing weight of our lost dreams, the plans for our future that I had so meticulously built with hope and love. In that moment, I made a silent vow that I would no longer allow her infidelity to define my existence. I would gather every scrap of evidence, every hint of deceit, and expose the truth for all to see. With my mind racing and emotions boiling over, I decided that I couldn't return home without acting. I drove back through the rain, my vision blurred by tears and a burning determination. I knew that the next steps would be excruciating, confrontation, legal battles, and the painstaking process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by lies. But I also knew that I could no longer remain in the dark, shackled by the false promises of a marriage that was no longer real. That night, as I lay in bed with the relentless patter of rain outside, I drafted a plan. I would compile all the evidence, screenshots of messages, a detailed timeline of her suspicious activities, and every piece of information that could no longer be ignored. This dossier would be the cornerstone of my confrontation, the weapon I would wield when the time came. I also reached out to my closest friend, someone who had always been there to remind me of my worth, to share the devastation I felt and to seek advice on how to move forward. His words, filled with both empathy and a steely resolve, reassured me that I was not alone, that I deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In those quiet hours, as I meticulously organized my thoughts and my evidence, I felt the first stirrings of a new self, a version of me that would no longer be defined by betrayal, but by the unwavering commitment to my own truth. I realized that while the pain was deep, it was also the catalyst for a rebirth. I would no longer be a passive victim of deception. I would reclaim my life, piece by piece, and expose the lies that had so ruthlessly shattered the sanctuary we once called home. The storm outside eventually subsided, but inside, the tempest raged on. As I closed my journal and turned off the lamp, I knew that this was only the beginning. The revelation of that night had set me on a path that I could not turn back from, a path toward confrontation, exposure, and ultimately, a future where I would stand tall, defined by honesty, strength, and an unyielding commitment to myself. I drifted off to sleep with one final thought echoing in my mind: the truth would not be buried, and I would ensure that her betrayal, as painful as it was, would mark the end of an era, and the beginning of my own, unbreakable future. In the hours and days that followed that fateful discovery, my world shifted into a relentless whirlwind of pain and introspection. I felt as though the ground beneath me had become unsteady, every step I took measured in trembling uncertainty. That night at the bar had etched itself into my memory, her laugh mingling with another man's quiet conversation, the casual intimacy that should have been reserved for us, now glaringly public. I drove home in silence, the rain pounding on my windshield echoing the throb of betrayal in my heart. I couldn't bear the thought of returning to a home where every room now felt tainted with secrets, every familiar corner a reminder of a promise broken. At home, I locked myself in our study, the dim light from my desk lamp illuminating a sea of unanswered questions. I sat there for hours, staring blankly at the evidence I had mentally catalogued, the silhouette of her figure in that bar, the hushed words exchanged with that stranger, the painful sensation that every shared moment with her had been a carefully rehearsed performance hiding a devastating secret. My mind was a battleground, waves of anger crashed against swells of sorrow, and amidst that chaos, I found a tiny ember of resolve that refused to be snuffed out. I began scribbling my thoughts in my journal with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. I wrote about how the memory of that night seared through me like a burning brand, every detail, every tone of voice, every subtle gesture replayed in my mind until I could see the truth with brutal clarity. I thought our love was unassailable, I scrawled in jagged, desperate lines. But now I know it was built on nothing more than a fragile illusion. The act of writing was both cathartic and agonizing, a release of the bottled-up emotions that had been festering since I first caught that glimpse. I knew I had two choices: allow the betrayal to consume me or channel this agony into something that would ultimately reclaim my dignity. The next few days blurred together in a haze of restless energy and quiet determination. I found solace in long, aimless walks around the city at night. The cold air and the rhythmic patter of rain on the pavement became a stark backdrop against which I could sift through my memories and my mounting questions. I recalled the subtle signals I had once dismissed, the way her eyes would briefly dart to her phone during our intimate conversations, the sighs that punctuated her stories of a busy day, the small, almost imperceptible smiles that she reserved for moments when I wasn't looking. Now, they all converged into a damning portrait of deception. During one of these nocturnal walks, I met up with an old friend, Michael, whose steady presence had always provided me with a sense of clarity in moments of crisis. Over a quiet cup of coffee in a nearly deserted diner, I confided in him about everything: the bar, the whispered conversation, the betrayal that had shattered my trust. Michael listened intently, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet resolve. "You deserve the truth," he said, voice low and measured, "and you have every right to demand it, no matter how painful it is." His words resonated deeply, and as we talked, I began to understand that my pain could either be the end of me or the beginning of a new, stronger chapter. I left that conversation with a sense of purpose, a decision that I would confront this betrayal head-on and refuse to let it define my future. Determined to reclaim my power, I began to map out a plan. I spent the following days gathering every scrap of evidence that I could recall, reconstructing the timeline of that night from the fragments in my memory. I reached out to the bar's manager under the guise of a concerned patron, asking innocuous questions about the events of that evening, details that, when pieced together, confirmed the truth of my discovery. I even tried to recall the exact words I'd overheard, the cadence of their voices, the laughter that had once seemed so innocent, now sounded like a betrayal etched in every syllable. I wrote down everything meticulously, each detail a building block in the blueprint of my eventual confrontation. The more I delved into my thoughts and memories, the more I realized that I had been living in a delicate cocoon of trust, a cocoon that had been shattered by one careless, yet damning, moment of truth. I knew that I couldn't continue living in that comfortable ignorance, that I needed to force the truth into the open, even if it meant facing the worst possible confrontation. I began rehearsing what I would say, standing before the mirror with a mix of anger and sorrow etched on my face. "When did you stop loving me?" I'd ask, voice cracking with raw emotion. "Who is he? And why did you think you could hide it all from me?" Each repetition filled me with a fierce determination. I understood that the confrontation wouldn't be easy. It would be a collision of raw emotions, a clashing of truths that might leave me forever changed. But I was ready. I was determined to expose the hidden life that had so callously betrayed me, and in doing so, to reclaim my dignity. The night before I planned to confront her, I barely slept. I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop the only light in a dark, silent room, and reviewed every detail I had jotted down. I read through my notes until they blurred together, a litany of hurt, betrayal, and the unanswered questions that had tormented me for weeks. In that quiet solitude, the realization crystallized. I had to make her see the truth, not just for my own closure, but to prevent the cycle of deceit from repeating. I knew that my words would be laced with pain, that the conversation might tear apart what little remained of our shared history, but it was a necessary step. I was no longer the man who could turn a blind eye to betrayal. I had been awakened by the sting of deception, and with every ounce of my being, I vowed to confront it head-on. As the storm outside raged on, I drafted a final message that I would use to summon her to a meeting, a message that left no room for excuses, a message that was both simple and devastating: "We need to talk. I know everything." That message was the spark that set the tinder of my resolve ablaze, a declaration that the time for half-truths and whispered lies was over. I pressed send, feeling both a tremor of fear and a surge of empowerment. The waiting was excruciating, each minute stretching into an eternity as I wondered what her reaction would be. Would she deny it all? Would she beg for forgiveness? Or would the truth finally force her to confront the consequences of her actions? In the silence that followed, I found a strange, almost defiant calm. I understood that regardless of her response, I was ready to take the next step, a step that would force the truth out into the open and shatter the illusions we had once cherished. I was no longer the man who clung to false promises. I was a man transformed by the harsh light of reality, determined to reclaim my future, one painful truth at a time. I woke the next morning to an eerie quiet that seemed to seep into every corner of our home, a silence heavy with the echoes of last night's confrontation and the relentless ache of betrayal. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I sat in the living room, the air thick with memories of our shattered trust. I still felt the sting of every word exchanged the previous evening. My voice, firm and unyielding, demanding answers, her tearful, halting excuses that crumbled like brittle paper in the face of overwhelming evidence. In that final, raw moment of reckoning, I realized that everything had changed. The woman I once loved had been exposed for the liar she was, and now the path ahead, though steep and uncertain, was mine to shape anew. The confrontation had been more than just a cathartic release, it was the decisive act that severed the ties of our shared past. I had laid out the dossier of proof, every screenshot, every timestamp, every message that bore witness to her secret rendezvous at that bar with another man. Her excuses, so feeble and delusional, confirmed what I had suspected all along. The life we'd built was a facade, and she had chosen deceit over the honest intimacy we once shared. I recall the piercing look in her eyes as she tried to justify herself, a desperate plea for forgiveness that rang hollow in the sterile light of that painful evening. After she left the room, I remained motionless, listening to the silence that followed her departure, a silence that was as loud as any accusation. In that heavy quiet, I felt the gravity of my decision settle in. I realized that forgiving her would only mean becoming a slave to the same betrayal that had shattered my world. I needed to reclaim my identity, my dignity, and the future that was rightfully mine. That morning, I resolved to let the truth, as painful as it was, be the foundation upon which I would rebuild my life. Over the following weeks, I embarked on a journey of both legal and personal transformation. The divorce proceedings began in earnest, a series of long meetings with a seasoned attorney who understood that my case was more than just a split of assets. It was the unraveling of a web of lies that had poisoned every aspect of our marriage. Every document I signed, every court appearance, was a deliberate act of severance from a life built on false promises. I watched as the courtroom became a battleground where the evidence of her betrayal was laid bare for all to see, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of our shared past lift, replaced by a cautious hope for a new beginning. Outside the sterile corridors of legal proceedings, I turned my focus inward. I found solace in the quiet rituals that had once brought me comfort. Every morning, I took long walks under the pale light of dawn, letting the cool air and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps clear the fog of despair that had enveloped me. I reconnected with old passions, dusting off my guitar and strumming familiar chords that carried memories of simpler times, revisiting the books that had once been my escape, and even picking up a paintbrush to capture on canvas the turbulent emotions that had defined my recent days. With every act of creative expression, I began to see that while the scars of betrayal might never fully disappear, they could serve as symbols of my strength and resilience. I also found the courage to share my journey with others. I started a blog, pouring out my raw, unedited story, the moment I discovered her deceit at that bar, the crushing confrontation that followed, and the long, arduous process of reclaiming my self-worth. My words, honest to the point of vulnerability, resonated with countless readers who had weathered their own storms of betrayal. The flood of messages, filled with empathy and shared experiences, affirmed that I was not alone in my struggle. Each story I read, every comment that encouraged me to stand tall, became a beacon of light guiding me out of the darkness. One particularly transformative day, I attended a support group for those who had faced infidelity. In that circle of strangers, I found a mirror reflecting not only my pain but also the potential for renewal. I listened to others recount their heartaches and triumphs, and slowly, I began to understand that the most painful experiences, while scarring, also held the seeds of profound personal growth. Their words stirred something deep within me, a realization that I could rebuild my identity from the ruins of our broken marriage, that I was capable of creating a future defined by honesty and self-respect. As the legal process neared its conclusion, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure. The final court session was a quiet affair, the judge's words formal and detached as he finalized our divorce. Stepping out of the courthouse, I felt both the gravity of what I had lost and the liberating promise of what I had yet to gain. I knew that the road ahead would be steep and the scars might never fully fade, but I also knew that I was ready to embrace a future that was unequivocally mine, a future where every decision would be guided by the hard-won wisdom of experience. In the weeks that followed, I began to transform our once-shared home into a sanctuary for my rebirth. I redecorated with deliberate care, choosing colors and textures that spoke of resilience and new beginnings. The photographs that once captured our happy moments were replaced by art that symbolized rebirth, a phoenix rising from the ashes, bold and unyielding. Every corner of my new space was a testament to the journey I had endured, a physical reminder that even when trust is shattered, it is possible to rebuild from the ruins. I threw myself into my work, channeling the tumultuous energy of my emotions into creative projects that redefined my professional identity. I took on challenging assignments, collaborated with colleagues who admired my newfound clarity, and allowed myself to be recognized not as a betrayed husband but as a talented individual with a story of transformation to tell. Each success at work was a small victory, a brick in the foundation of a new life that I was building, one where the echoes of betrayal no longer dictated my worth. There were, of course, moments of lingering pain, nights when the memories of that fateful evening would flood back, overwhelming me with a raw mix of grief and longing for what once was. In those quiet hours before sleep, I would sit by the window, watching the moon cast its pale glow over the city, and I would allow myself to feel the sorrow fully before gently turning my thoughts toward the hope of tomorrow. I learned that true healing was not about erasing the past but about integrating it into a narrative of growth, a narrative that celebrated my strength, resilience, and capacity to rebuild. One crisp morning, as the sun broke over the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink, I stepped out onto the balcony of my new apartment and took a long, deep breath. In that moment, I realized that my journey from the dark depths of betrayal to the bright promise of renewal was complete. The pain had been a harsh teacher, but it had imparted in me a wisdom that no amount of deception could ever diminish. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided by a hidden affair. I was a man reborn, a man who had transformed heartbreak into a powerful catalyst for change. In that final, liberating moment, I made a solemn promise to myself. I would never allow the shadows of the past to darken my future. I vowed to live with honesty, to demand truth in all my relationships, and to cherish the strength that comes from overcoming even the deepest wounds. My heart, though scarred, beat with the steady rhythm of resilience, and every step I took was a declaration that my life was mine to shape, a life defined by my own choices, not by the deceit of others. Today, as I sit in the soft light of a new dawn, I reflect on the painful journey that led me here, a journey of shattered illusions, relentless confrontation, and, ultimately, a rebirth forged in the fire of betrayal. I have reclaimed my identity, my dignity, and my future, and I stand as a testament to the unyielding power of truth. The wounds will always be there, reminders of the past, but they no longer bind me. Instead, they propel me forward, urging me to create a life filled with genuine love, unwavering respect, and the promise of new beginnings. I know that the path ahead will have its challenges and that the scars of yesterday may never fully fade. But I also know that with every sunrise, I move closer to a future where my heart is free, where trust is a treasure earned, and where every moment is an opportunity to live authentically. The storm of betrayal has passed, and in its wake, a new dawn has emerged, a dawn of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who dared to reclaim his life.